All right. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Sue, and to everyone at NEEP for inviting me to be here today in such an impressive lineup of speakers. It's really a little daunting. So, like many of you, I go to work every day to develop policies to combat climate change. And to be honest, this can be pretty discouraging, particularly during times when it seems like the traction that the states are losing traction on their progress towards achieving their greenhouse gas emissions, or when it feels like progress is slipping away. A few years ago, my husband and I started talking about whether to have a family. And I was really struggling with whether I wanted to bring a child into this world that was inevitably going to be dominated by climate change. There's a little island across the bridge that many of you passed over on your way here today. That's where my dad grew up, where I grew up, and where my children will grow up. But I don't know what the fate of that small island is going to be in the span of my children's lifetime or my grandchildren's lifetime. And given Sue's prediction earlier this morning, it doesn't look like it's going to be very good. Rhode Island is on track to have a climate like Atlanta, Georgia. So Lord help my kids if they inherit the Anthony genetics for excessive sweating. Hey, they told us to get personal here. At a point where the E&E staff was feeling particularly discouraged, we decided to go back to basics and analyze emissions trends in the Northeast. This eventually became our report that's known as Climate Vision 2020. And what we found really surprised us. We found that the states as a whole had successfully reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 12% below 1990 levels by 2010. At the same time, we were beginning to see new technologies come onto the market that had the promise of lower carbon emissions. When we combined the momentum from the state's early achievements with these new technologies, we began to see a pathway forward that really energized us. Ultimately, my husband and I did have a baby. He's about 9 months old now. And as I'm sure is true of all children, the sense of renewed hope and optimism that came along with his life were immediate and totally overwhelming. I just have to have hope for his future. So what I hope you leave this talk with today is that same sense of renewed hope and optimism and a feeling of being re-energized because we have a pathway forward and we have the tools that we need in order to achieve a low-carbon, sustainable energy future. So the story of E&E's energy vision starts with our Climate Vision report. As I mentioned, Climate Vision showed that the Northeast states had successfully achieved their early 2010 emissions reduction targets. But Climate Vision also showed that the states were not on track to meet more ambitious greenhouse gas emission reduction targets in 2020 or in 2050. Climate Vision shed light on 3 revealing trends in the Northeast. The first is that we've experienced a transformation of our power generation sector. We've increased our use of renewable energy. Our states are making cost-effective investments in energy efficiency. We've had fuel switching from coal and oil to natural gas. Taken together, these 3 factors have contributed to a 44% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions from power generation since 2005. Digging a little deeper shows that fuel switching alone is responsible for nearly half of that total decline in emissions. The second key trend is in our transportation sector. So while transportation makes up 47% of the region's total greenhouse gas emissions, it has gone largely unaddressed. And the third key trend is in our building sector. Our home heating oil customers, who make up about 42% of the households in Rhode Island, they still have very limited access to our electric and natural gas energy efficiency programs, and this really constrains the potential for energy savings from those homes and buildings. On the natural gas side, we're squeezing the energy savings out of our homes through weatherization and efficient equipment, but we can't squeeze the carbon out of gas. We need a different strategy in order to achieve deeper decarbonization. So Climate Vision left E&E with a few conclusions. The first is that we have momentum from the state's early achievements, but the gap between where we are today and where we need to be if we're going to achieve our long-term climate goals remains large. And the primary driver of greenhouse gas reductions over the past decade, which is fuel switching, is pretty much exhausted. With coal and oil making up less than 7% of today's power mix, we can't count on natural gas for continued declines in greenhouse gas emissions. But on the flip side, this transformation of our power generation sector has created an opportunity to actually use electricity to drive deep greenhouse gas emission reductions in our building and transportation sectors. So we usually think of old-style electric resistance heat as being the most wasteful, expensive, and inefficient technology that there is. But we have new technologies. There was a whole panel on them yesterday. We have new technologies that we can plug into our grid today to get lower costs and lower emissions. And as we add more renewables to the grid, the climate benefits will grow. So consider things like electric vehicles, our high-efficiency electric heat pumps, our heat pump hot water heaters. These are all products that are available to consumers now at our local auto dealerships or Home Depot. Heat pumps are particularly compelling in the Northeast, where we have some of the highest heating costs in the country due to our reliance on delivered fuels like oil and propane. But heat pumps have 60% fewer greenhouse gas emissions than using oil to heat a typical New England home, and they can do so at half the cost. High-efficiency electric heat pumps, their operating costs are about on par with natural gas right now, but they don't come with the risks of over-investing in natural gas distribution system expansions that can't deliver long-term greenhouse gas reductions. On the transportation side, Rhode Island drivers spent $1.3 billion on gasoline and diesel in 2011. 73% of that total expenditure went directly to petroleum producers who are located in other countries, in other regions. This represents a massive transfer of wealth outside of this state, which Rhode Island definitely can't afford. But electric vehicles can be fueled at 65% lower cost than gasoline vehicles, and they deliver climate benefits of about the same magnitude. And when we plug our cars into our power grid, we have the tools like renewable energy and the policies like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative to ensure declining emissions. So we have proven and existing technologies that we can plug into the grid today and get lower costs and lower carbon emissions. And as we work towards achieving our renewable portfolio standards and add more and more renewables to the grid, those climate benefits will continue to grow. And it's getting more possible to do that, to add more and more renewables to the grid. The levelized cost of solar PV has fallen by 63% since 2009. This has allowed Massachusetts to achieve their goal of 250 megawatts of solar electricity 4 years early and set a new goal of 1.6 gigawatts by 2020. So imagine if all of that solar power were connected to our cars for charging, battery storage, or providing stability back to the grid. In fact, if all 5.5 million passenger vehicles in New England were battery electric, like the Nissan Leaf, we would have 444 gigawatts of capacity. That's 16 times the ISO New England regional peak. So E&E did the math. If all gasoline vehicles and all fossil fuel heated homes switch to electricity, we can achieve a 50% reduction in emissions overnight. By successfully implementing our renewable portfolio standards and adding more renewables to the grid, we can get to an 80% reduction. But the grid we have today is not designed for this level of distributed generation or intermittent renewables. The grid we have today is designed for utilities. It's designed to deliver power one way from large fossil fuel-fired generators, and it assumes that consumers have inelastic demand. The incentives that drive investments on our grid continue to skew decisions in favor of more large capital and infrastructure projects, but these things are not helping the grid keep up with changing consumer expectations for more choice, more control, new technologies and innovation, more flexibility, and easier interconnection. And when utilities describe the grid of the future, they still often place themselves in the center of that picture and in control. But imagine if the grid of the future put the consumer in control and put the consumer in the center. This would be a grid that would embrace new technology and make it easy for us to do what we want to do, whether that's improve the efficiency of our homes, put solar on our roof to charge our cars, benefit from time of use prices, or contract with third parties who could optimize our energy production and consumption and sell those services back to the grid. There are many people across the country right now trying to figure out how to save the utility and save the utility business model from a future that's characterized by widespread distributed generation and deep energy efficiency. I think our challenge is to change the conversation. How can we design our grid so that we put the consumer back in the center and maximize benefits for consumers in the environment? I think it's really fun and exciting to think about what the future is going to be like, how the grid is going to look, how it's going to function, and how we'll interact with it, what our role will be. But I do want to come back to the primary theme of the summit today, which is that energy efficiency is still our least cost fuel. Several states in the region are achieving nation-leading levels of energy savings. You're in one. And we're delivering immediate economic benefits to consumers. And in fact, electrification is a lot easier when you do it on a foundation of deep energy efficiency. But the investments in efficiency that these leading states are making are also delivering systemic benefits. And ISO New England is proving that energy efficiency can reduce expenditure on costly transmission, and those are savings that accrue to ratepayers in all 6 New England states. So given that there are several states that are not yet achieving 2.5 or 2.6% electric savings, there is enormous potential for cost-effective energy efficiency to provide even greater benefits to the regional grid. So what if our states work together to reform utility incentives and level the playing field for all energy resources? This would create a pathway to lower infrastructure costs, greater economic benefits to consumers through energy efficiency, and deep greenhouse gas reductions from clean distributed generation. So E&E is so excited about this potential for a low-carbon, consumer-friendly energy future. And working with all of the stakeholders that need to be involved, and a lot of you in this room, here's what we're doing. We're developing alternative approaches to managing the grid and re-envisioning the role of utilities. We're making proposals for regulatory reform that realign utility incentives with maximizing consumer and environmental benefits. And we're taking this message wherever we go in hopes that decisions at all levels, whether they're municipal land use planning choices to large-scale regional infrastructure proposals, are made with this energy vision in mind. So the question I want to leave you with today is, how can we ensure that the decisions that we're making now and in the near term enable and accelerate our ability to achieve this energy vision in the future? And thank you.